no photos of Earth.
Perhaps one of the most surprising things about the Apollo landings on the Moon was that the astronauts did not specifically take photographs of the Earth, although there is one Earth scene in the video of the Apollo 17 mission. In the previous video, we discussed whether the astronauts could see stars or not, but there is no doubt that they saw the Earth and all of its blue marbled resplendence. So why they didn't take the odd snapshot is totally inexplicable and downright suspicious for our skeptics. As far as I can fathom, the believers do not see this as a major omission, as they make little comment on it, although they do make mention of exposure problems, and the issue is not being able to photograph the stars due to the brightness of the Moon's surface. The astronauts had no problems viewing the Earth, so it is totally bewildering that they didn't take any photographs of it. Our skeptics are keen to imagine that they went to the Moon and contemplate on what they would have done on arrival. As we have mentioned in the previous video, there are basically just 3 things on the Moon to grab the visitor's attention: the moonscape, the Earth, and the stars. The skeptics maintain that in none of the Apollo missions did the astronauts specifically take a photograph of the Earth or of the stars. This fact for many of our skeptics is totally incomprehensible. There are some photographs in which the Earth has been allegedly added later by NASA using superimposition, perhaps for presentation purposes. Even here, the skeptics question NASA's ability to fake anything correctly, as they claim that the superimposed images of the Earth are far too small. In fact, they maintain ridiculously tiny. Imagine you are looking at the Moon here on Earth, a bright orb in the sky. Now imagine that the Moon is the size of Earth 3.6 times bigger, the Earth diameter being 7,926 miles and the Moon diameter 2,159 miles. The visible area would be 13.5 times as large, quite a noticeable and impressive sight. In the photographs alleged by the skeptics to have been doctored by NASA, the Earth is shown to be about the same size as we see the Moon from Earth, and on some even much smaller than that. Imagine how better the doctored photograph would have looked with the proper sized Earth superimposed. The skeptics ask, wasn't somebody at NASA thinking very clearly that day, or didn't they care that much about the final detail? It is really hard for the skeptics to comprehend that they did go all the way to the Moon, look back, and admire the beautiful blue orb that is the Earth, and do not think to take any photographs. After all, as we shall see in the later video series, the astronauts went to considerable lengths to show us the video of Earth as they traveled away from it on their journey to the Moon. This is different from the argument for the astronauts not seeing the stars or thinking that they did not see stars, as the astronauts did say that they gazed at the Earth, so the skeptics repeatedly ask, why no photographs? Our skeptic Marcus Allen gives us some idea of the problems he thinks that NASA had in relation to the photography in his presentation to the 5th British Exopolitics Expo held at the University of Huddersfield, UK in 2013. I would just like to highlight 2 interesting pieces of this presentation. The first, at video time frame 1516, we see a photograph in which what appears to be the American flag seen reflecting in the shadow of the lunar lander, and this surprisingly before it even gets to be erected. Marcus Allen naturally concludes that there would be something very strange if the reflection is of the erected American flag, as it was not erected by the 2 astronauts until 45 minutes later. On further analysis, this reflection is simply the visual landing guidelines etched onto the Apollo Lunar Lander Module window behind Buzz Aldrin, as can be seen in this NASA photograph AS11-365390. Secondly, at video time 3321, we see 2 photographs. The first photograph shows Irwin photographed by Scott, and in the second, Scott photographed by Irwin. The problem with these 2 photographs is that there is only one camera, and Scott is shown to have it on him, so how could Irwin have taken Scott's photograph? A very interesting anomaly for which I have found no response from any of our believers. However, enough confusion, so let's move on and examine some of the main issues raised by the Apollo moon photography and videos.
Inconsistent shadows.
The skeptics will labor to remind you that the Apollo astronauts did not take any equipment for extra lighting on the moon. Therefore, they say the only lighting available on the moon was the singular source of direct light from the sun. The sun is approximately 93 million miles distant from the moon, and at that distance the rays of sunlight are basically parallel all the time as they reach the moon. The skeptics contend that, therefore, the shadows cast on the moon by different objects should also be parallel to each other. In many photographs, the shadows are anything but parallel. The skeptics therefore conclude that there must have been more than one light source, and therefore the photographs could not have been taken on the moon. Just about every skeptic mentions this perceived anomaly, and paradoxically, just about every believer jumps in to defend the concept of parallel shadows. When I first saw this argument, I was puzzled. It immediately reminded me of my old art teacher, Miss Jenkins, who seemed to have an overwhelming passion for us to paint bunches of flowers, piles of fruit, and boxes piled one on top of another, while all I wanted to do was paint naked women. After all, this is why I chose the art option. However, enough digressing about my ill-spent youth, but there is one thing I did learn from Miss Jenkins, was that shadows should not be parallel in a picture or photograph. She explained it was due to perspective. Try this. Go outside and find a long stretch of straight road. Jump into your helicopter and hover above the road. Look down directly below you at the road and see for yourself that the sides of the road are indeed parallel. If you are not convinced, take out your tape measure and check it. Now go and stand in the middle of the road. I am assuming that I do not need to caution you to check that no great articulated lorry is heading your way. Now look along that road. Do the sides of the road look parallel? I think you will answer no, but you just convinced yourself from your helicopter and by measurement that they were. So what happened? I can assure you that they are parallel, well, more or less. If you look into the far distance, the sides of the road will appear to converge into one point. Well, this is the same with shadows. It is called perspective, at least that is what Miss Jenkins told me. If you stood on the ground and all you can see are parallel shadows, then maybe you are on Mars. You are certainly not on Earth. The shadows will be parallel on the ground, but you will not see it unless you are sat on the sun. Just one more caveat to this shadow angles saga. The more the light source is coming from the side, then the more parallel the shadows will appear as they are not being affected by distant perspective. If the light is precisely at right angles to the field of view, then the shadows will indeed look parallel. The same as if you look directly across the road to the other side, then the sides of the road will look parallel. By the way, this shadow angle discussion applies equally well to videos, but none of the skeptics seem to make a big point about this. The skeptic's opinion that the shadow lines should be parallel is truly one if you are viewing the scene directly from above, or, as previously mentioned, the light is directly from the side. In those cases, there is then no perspective involved. When you are at ground level surrounded by the objects making the shadows, then perspective dictates that shadows cannot be parallel. Now, according to Miss Jenkins, all shadows in a picture or photograph must converge into a vanishing point, so they cannot ever be parallel, subject to my caveats mentioned above. I really never thought Miss Jenkins's art class would ever be of any constructive use to me, but as often happens, I was wrong. I am sorry if I have labored this point, but it is important that we understand this concept of shadow angles. The skeptics labor this mistaken belief time and time again and point to the numerous photographs in which the shadows are not parallel and in some extreme cases appear to be most at right angles. The worst examples they are keen to show you is the photographs from the book Full Moon by Michael Light, which contains official photographs released by NASA in which they appear to be shadows from the front, from the left, and from the right. This anomaly, the skeptics maintain, indicates that there must have been more than one light source, which on the moon would be impossible, but in a studio set on Earth, it would be entirely possible. Now, drawing lines through the shadows of the tiny rocks and guessing the angles of the shadow can be rather arbitrary and lead to all sorts of dubious estimation. I am not saying that the photographs were not faked on Earth, I just do not know. The skeptics identify a number of photos which show that they are claimed to be shadows pointing in very different directions. However, the believers also mistakenly argue that the comparison is between well-defined shadows in the foreground and very oblique shadows in the background. Shadows lie on parallel lines pointing away from the sun. They maintain that because of perspective, they will appear to radiate away from the point on the horizon directly under the sun. Furthermore, the believers state that closer examination of most of the photograph shows that the seemingly mismatched shadows are being cast on very uneven ground surfaces. For example, one rock may be higher than the surface where its shadow falls, and this together with perspective and uneven surfaces can account for this apparent discrepancy. This argument seems to be superfluous, as shadows should not be parallel in any case, at least according to Miss Jenkins, and with her long slender legs, I was always totally inclined to believe anything she told me. It is not a matter of whether the shadows are parallel or not, but whether you can ever view them as parallel. The believers furthermore say that if you take a brief look around outdoors on a sunny day, then you will see that the shadows of nearby objects do not line up with more distant ones, or even point directly away from the sun. The reason is that you don't line up the base of the object with its shadow, as it is assumed by some skeptics, but you need to consider a line from a point on the edge of the shadow through that part of the object that casts the part of the shadow. They say that it is simply incorrect to draw lines from the base of the lunar module through its shadow to see if the shadows were consistent. You need to draw lines from objects on the lunar module to their corresponding shadows, that these lines will converge on the sun. I really don't follow this logic. An additional consideration the skeptics point out is that two objects of the same size but different distances from a light source will cast different lengths of shadow. You can easily test this at home. The object closer to the light source will have a longer shadow than the one further away from the light source. However, because the sun is so far away, two equal-sized objects on the moon should both cast about the same shadow length, as they are both basically equidistant from the sun. Skeptics have identified NASA photographs in which the two astronauts, when standing reasonably close to each other, cast very different shadow lengths. According to the skeptics, this must prove that there was more than one source of light, which we have already seen would be impossible on the moon. They therefore conclude that these photographs cannot have been taken on the moon. The believers contend that the only problem here is that the skeptics have forgotten about the unevenness of the moon's surface. In other words, on uneven ground, the shadows can appear to be at different angles, and shadow lengths can differ considerably in length. The Clavius website provides an example of this effect and claims to rebut the criticism, and therefore the use of more than one light source does not follow. The believers do agree that if you could view the situation from above, then it is true that all of the shadows will indeed be parallel, but they contend that the photos were taken on rough, hilly landscapes, which are bound to produce all manner of shadow lengths no matter where you stand. This is due to the perspective effect experienced by the viewer. Again, the believers seem to be needlessly defending the parallel shadow misnomer. The believers on the Mythbusters show have also conducted their own in-house experiments to reproduce the effect and demonstrate that shadows need not be parallel. Their demonstration was not very realistic, as they used a single source of light to represent the sun, which they placed just a few feet from the model stage so that the light was radiating out from the point source, adding to the non-parallel effect. On the moon, the rays of the sunlight are basically parallel. The question of non-parallel shadows is answered quite simply by believer Graham Stickings, who got out of his chair, went outside on a sunny day, and made a video outside his local garage on quite level ground. He demonstrates quite conclusively, at least to me, that here on Earth shadows would not appear to be parallel due to perspective, and his video clearly shows that shadows at very different angles in such a simple scene. Unfortunately, he hasn't drawn in the yellow lines accurately because all shadows must converge into one vanishing point. The actual vanishing point in his photograph appears to be just above the nearest petrol pump, where he has a yellow blob. You can see that the two shadow lines from the sign are not correct, and the one from the bollard is anybody's guess, as you cannot see the total shadow. So grab your camera, put on your sunglasses, and go to your local petrol station and try it for yourself. Our believer, Jay Windley, on the Clavius website, explains that objects can indeed form shadows that are not parallel and for the same size object can have different shadow lengths. This analysis by Clavius is challenged by the skeptic Hunchback, in which he maintains that Clavius has many misconceptions and misses several points in his analysis. In his video, he makes the point that all shadows must converge into a single vanishing point, and he uses this fact to point out some anomalies in the Apollo photos. At last, somebody else who must have also gone to Miss Jenkins' art class, all shadows must converge into a single vanishing point. Our penultimate contribution in the Shadow Saga comes from the true believer Brant Watson. In this video, he makes a convoluted and surprisingly feeble attempt to justify the shadow problem. He apparently does not know what Miss Jenkins taught me so many years ago, that shadows cannot be parallel and must converge at a vanishing point, even though at video time 200, he basically has the proof of this in the yellow shade lines he has drawn on the photograph. Had Brant been fully informed about shadows, he could have just pointed that photograph with his drawn lines and point proved QED. This point is important because it is this particular photograph which the skeptics invariably offer as their conclusive proof of more than one light source. One final attempt to convince you that shadows cannot be parallel when viewed in a photograph. I will refer you to Figure 1 in a paper from Louis Bilbado on the Alice website. We will discuss this paper in the next section on ray tracing. In this photograph, you can see that the sun is shining through a set of doors. The shadows on the ground are actually parallel, but to a viewer they look anything but parallel. They do in fact look to converge to a vanishing point. This is because you are viewing a three-dimensional phenomenon in a two-dimensional view. I am not saying that all the photographs were taken on the moon or were taken on Earth or even some mix in between, as I do not know. I am merely trying to clarify this misnomer of parallel shadows so that we can better appreciate this erroneously perceived anomaly. Finally, if we are truly concerned about the strange shadows, then we must really pay attention to a scene from Jet Windsor's highly acclaimed film, Moon Hoax Now. In this video, Jet identifies some strange shadow anomalies at time 242 in the Apollo 16 missions at Station 2. This consists of two large moving shadows covering the entire landscape all the way to the horizon and from two different directions. This should be totally impossible with the sun as the only light source, and there is nothing tall enough to block out the light to that extent and to produce a shadow all the way to the horizon. This is clearly a significant discovery, and I would imagine hard, if not possible, for the believers to explain. I have been unable to find any believers who comment on this anomaly, even though I am confident that they have seen this well-known video. I could wax on and on about the Apollo shadows and how both skeptic and believer are most scientifically confused on the subject, but now after this investigation, I feel free that I am a shadow of my former self. So what do we know? There may well be photographs in which the shadows are incorrect, and this may indicate that additional light sources were used, but to me it is not a compelling argument that the Apollo missions were faked. The important thing that we have learned is that the skeptics and believers' assertion on parallel shadows is certainly incorrect. However, the shadows shown by Jet Windsor may be extremely significant and certainly hard to explain. Another smoking gun? What is your view?
Ray tracing.
Perhaps a better way to examine the Apollo photographs for secondary lighting is to use a method of ray tracing. This technique is much more reliable than simply looking at the shadows, and it does have the added advantage that it does not depend on the unevenness of the ground. We have a paper by Louis Bilbado from the Alice website which explains the problems associated with viewing a three-dimensional phenomenon on a two-dimensional plane. At the beginning of his paper, he states, "Shadows as reproduced in a photograph are a projection of a 3D phenomenon into a 2D plane that sometimes creates counterintuitive results. Today there are many software applications that can reproduce the shadow pattern of a model. However, by applying very simple simulations, even using a spreadsheet, it is possible to demonstrate that there are no reliable grounds based on shadow directions alone to assert whether or not more than one light source is present in any given Apollo lunar surface picture. He also further states that shadow analysis is therefore not the best way to determine whether or not more than one light source is present in photographs where the terrain is irregular and object separation may be quite large. A better approach and a far more powerful and reliable method is to deploy the technique of ray tracing. Light rays are straight lines in both the 3D world and in the 2D image plane. They do not depend on the shape of the terrain and can be extended even beyond the objects. In a uniform medium, light propagates in a straight line. Rays from a distant source are parallel and they do not cross each other, but their projection on the film surface may appear to be convergent. Although not visible, it is possible to follow the direction of a ray by identifying point couples that belong to them. For example, with an illuminated point and its corresponding shadow. In what follows, the term ray will refer to the direction of the light propagated that includes the region to where the light actually propagates and the region beyond opaque bodies. And the ray tracing technique has the added advantage of being independent of the terrain contours. As long as a point and its corresponding shadow can be determined, the ray is easily constructed because those points belong to a ray. This technique produces some interesting results. A. If a unique source of light is present, then all the rays converge to a unique point. And B. If the source is behind the camera and its shadow is present in the photo, then the convergence point coincides with the shadow of the camera. And C. If the source is in front of the camera, then all rays converge towards the source. The important point here is that when the source of illumination is in front of the camera, then the rays will converge towards the source. He uses point couples to trace the rays. Point couples are 2 points, one on the real object and one on the shadow that corresponds to the point on the real object. Using these pair of points, he can trace the rays and extend them to the point of convergence, which on Apollo must be the Sun. He examines NASA photo AS14-68-9486, which shows the lunar lander, and concludes, analysis carried out for the paper indicates that in the case of the image AS14-68-9486, while the astronaut casts no shadow in the region where it should be visible, there are significant anomalies present with the LM and the flag shadows, suggesting the presence of a second source of light. This is a significant find and could well be a smoking gun. It, of course, doesn't prove that man didn't step on the moon, but clearly indicates that the photograph could not have been taken on the moon. His conclusions are, in case of photo AS14-68-9486, a simple analysis of shadow directions alone is not enough to reach an objective conclusion regarding the presence of more than one light source, nor the divergence or convergence of the light beam. It is advisable to use the additional technique of ray tracing. Application for the ray tracing technique is more powerful than the one based on shadow directions. By using 12 ray segments from the shadows produced by the rock and the limb, it is possible to determine the position of the light source. Then by drawing the rays emanating from the source, it is possible to check whether or not a shadow in the image is compatible with the presence of a point light source. Of course, further careful analysis, which includes more ray segments, could be conducted in order to decrease the uncertainty of the source location and to discriminate, beyond error limits, the shadows that are incompatible with a unique point-like source. Additionally, the appearance of flares and rays could be studied further. Brightly lit shade. On several NASA photographs, the astronaut or other object, ostensibly in deep shadow, appear to be unexpectedly brightly lit. For example, in one famous photograph taken by Neil Armstrong, in which Buzz Aldrin is climbing down the ladder of the lunar module. But his body is so well lit that you can clearly see detail on his spacesuit. Skeptics argue that you should not be able to see so much detail as he is in the total dark shadow of the lunar module. The photo is used as an example by the Mythbusters, who attempt to demonstrate, using a scale model, how the astronauts could be so well lit. They conclude that the reflectivity of the moon's surface causes him to be well lit. Here, an interjection by the author who has some experience of model simulation. The Mythbusters used a small-scale model. They don't give the scale factor, but they used moon dust with exactly the same reflective properties of the real moon's surface. They should have also scaled down the reflective properties of the moon dust by whatever factor they used for the model. Light diminishes according to the square of the distance, so one would expect a small 6-inch astronaut to be better lit than a real 6-foot astronaut if you use the real reflectivity. There is also a question in what way the Mythbusters' light source related to the intensity of the sunlight striking the moon. However, the Mythbusters video has been challenged by 2 Russian professional cinematographers, Yuri Elkov and Leonard Konovalov. They decided to repeat the Mythbusters experiment and verify whether the reflected light from the lunar surface light can actually illuminate the astronaut to such an extent as in NASA's well-known picture sequence. They not only accuse them of cheating, but also conclude that the photograph of Buzz Aldrin cannot have been taken on the moon. Unfortunately, the video is in Russian, but you can see the drift. I wonder how and when the Russians would get involved in the debate. The believers also claim that there is a slight difference between being in the shadow and being in front of one. Some of the Apollo photographs were criticized for showing brightly illuminated astronauts in the shadow of the spacecraft, but it is clear that the sun was shining obliquely in the scene and the astronauts were above or in front of the shadow. One celebrated picture shows an astronaut with the sun behind him and the lunar lander and American flag reflected in his visor. According to the skeptics, the astronaut should have been merely a silhouette as he was standing in total shadow, and so he should, if he was not surrounded by brightly lit ground, reply the believers. If the full moon can brightly illuminate Earth from 250,000 miles away, just imagine how the sun can illuminate the moon's surface and an astronaut standing on it. This is discussed by Ian Williams Goddard in 2001. Goddard carried out several experiments using models and artificial light sources to show that the illuminated figures, supposedly in total shadow, may be a result of reflection from the moon's surface. We will close our look at brightly lit shade with a light-hearted interview with James Clarkson interviewing Marcus Allen on BBC Two TV in 1999.
Crosshairs.
As we have mentioned earlier, the Hasselblad camera was fitted with a reservoir plate engraved with a geometrical pattern of crosshairs. The position of the reservoir plate immediately next to the film means that the crosshairs must appear on every photograph taken with the camera. The skeptics point to the photographs in which the crosshairs from the reservoir plate are not complete on the photograph. Parts of the crosshairs appear to go behind the object of the image, which should be impossible given the position of the reservoir plate, from which they conclude that the photograph has been doctored in some way. They also claim that in some photographs the crosshairs are misaligned. The believers state that this only appears in copied and scanned photos, but not on the originals. I am not sure whether you could find the original photographs. It is caused by overexposure in the scanner. The bright white areas of the emulsion bleed over the thin black crosshairs. The crosshairs are only about 0.004 inches thick, and emulsion would only have bled about half that much to fully obscure it. Furthermore, there are many photos where the middle of the crosshair is washed out, but the rest is intact. In some photos of the American flag, parts of one crosshair appear to be on the red stripes, but parts of the same crosshair are faded or invisible on the white stripes. The believers contend that there would have been no reason to paste white stripes onto the flag. But for some of the skeptics, these incomplete crosshairs show incontestable proof that the photographs have been subsequently manipulated and not in their original form. If this is true, then one must question why photographs would be doctored by NASA in such a way. The believers argue that this does not make sense, for if NASA had decided to fake the landings and film the whole event here on Earth, then why introduce the crosshairs? Why not use any camera without crosshairs? They also state that somebody editing out distracting crosshairs for press releases makes perfect sense, but for our skeptics, this argument makes little sense. The skeptics respond that if this was done for press release purposes, then why was it not done consistently and remove all crosshairs, not just random parts of crosshairs? The question, as always, is what's on the original NASA film? And that is something that we may never discover. I am not convinced that we are able to draw any definite conclusions on this subject of missing or dubious-looking crosshairs. Whatever the answer, it does not prove that man did not go to the moon.
The scenery and repeated background scenery.
There has been much criticism from the skeptics that identical backgrounds can be found in the NASA Apollo photos taken on the moon at locations which are supposedly several miles apart. A typical example of this is described by one skeptic, JohanNyorkman.com, for the Apollo 17 lunar rover transverse in the Taurus Littrow Valley, in which he shows that the same distinct background can be found at 7 stations which are, according to the NASA Traverse map, miles apart. The evidence presented in this video appears to be quite compelling, but let's not judge yet. Our believers have something to say on this topic. Our believer, Brant Watson, aka AstroBrant2, responds to say that this is one of the most preposterous arguments put forth by the skeptics, and answers in his typical condescending style and somewhat boring style to repudiate this video. In this video, Brant provides an equally convincing argument that all is as one would expect, and that JohanNyorkman.com failed to make a proper analysis of the terrain. We also have further evidence from Paranormal Crucible of background anomaly. The background they claim must be faked, as one photograph of the mountain shows the lunar module in the picture, and in another photograph showing what looks like the same mountain background does not show the lunar lander, and we all know that the lunar lander never moved from its landing position. The believers say that you can easily create such a photograph yourself. Drive to some location with a hilly background, park so that you overlook the view, take one photograph with your car in the foreground, and then move slightly to the side of your car and take another photograph without your car in the shot. Now, when you compare the distant backdrops in the two photographs, it will look as though your car has mysteriously vanished. A rather famous claim by the skeptics is the so-called alligator rock, and it is often cited by skeptics as the definite proof of the Apollo hoax. It actually occurs on EVA-2 of the Apollo 16 mission. I think this claim was first made by James Collier in Part 6 of his Was It Only a Paper Moon, and has been subsequently repeated by many skeptics. You can see this at video timeframe 142. The video shows the astronauts on the top of a hill standing next to what Collier summarizes to be the lunar rover. Halfway down the hill is the alligator rock in the center of the picture. The next time we see this scene occurring is at time 422, and the astronauts are walking down the hill. There is the same alligator rock present, but no lunar rover at the top of the hill. The commentary on the video suggests that this scene is the next day in a different location about 4 kilometers away. So there you have it, proof that NASA was using the same fake backgrounds to ostensibly show different locations. Unfortunately for our overexcited skeptics, there is no fakery involved. It is probably a genuine mistake by NASA, who has the habit of just releasing small segments of video, and in this sequence the order shown is incorrect. How do I know this? Well, we will let believer Bertie Slack explain as he corrects another skeptic who has repeated the same hoax claim. He shows the continuous TV transmission from the astronauts standing at the top of the hill to the second point as they walk down the hill, so continually linking the two clips that Collier showed. Towards the end of the video sequence, you see the astronaut pick up the bag which Collier thought was the lunar rover and walk down the hill carrying the bag. So, mystery solved. The two scenes were at the same location on the same day. It transpires that it was probably just a simple editing error by NASA.